Spindlehorse Tunes is facing legal action over unfair labor practices, and I have the documents in hand from the federal government with the details. A couple weeks ago, my friend Barsacorp sent me a tweet that was making the rounds, highlighting a case that had been filed with the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB. I don't have Twitter, so I couldn't see the extended discourse that was happening on this particular post, but as I shared the news with others, I had two different folks exclaim, "Wow, I can't believe they're getting sued," which isn't quite right. Normally I don't make videos like this, it veers close to drama for me. However, believe it or not, my formal education is in this very topic, labor law and practices. At long last, I get to put that degree to good use, talking about cartoons on the internet. First of all, let me make clear what's not happening. Spindlehorse is not getting sued. In a typical civil suit, the plaintiff and defendant each give their side of a case in a courtroom, generally to a jury. In a criminal case, again, prosecutor, defendant, jury. An NLRB case is very different. The process begins with a charging party who files a charge with the regional office of the board, accusing the respondent of some wrongdoing such as a breach of contract or other infraction of labor law. The regional office then sends agents to investigate the charge and collect the facts of the case. This is the stage that the Spindlehorse case currently sits at. If the regional office thinks the charge can be proven, it will then attempt to mediate a settlement between the charging party and the respondent. Most cases end at this stage. However, if a settlement cannot be reached, then the regional office will prosecute the case before an administrative law judge, who then will rule on the case and order what actions must be taken, if any, to correct the infraction. This can include things like remuneration or having to post notices in the workplace. Now, if either party is dissatisfied with the judge's ruling, they can appeal to the National Labor Relations Board directly, a panel of up to 5 presidential appointees confirmed by the Senate who will review the judge's decision and then either uphold that decision or issue a new one. The goal of this process is to attempt to answer workplace disputes in a way that is more streamlined and efficient, less costly, less of a wait. That said, this is a legal process, so it is still very much a wait even in the best of times. And these are not the best of times. Last year, shortly after taking office again, President Donald Trump fired one of the 3 standing members of the board, the first time that had ever happened in the institution's 90-year history. Given that it's meant to have 5 members and they only had 2, they failed to meet quorum and thus were unable to issue any decisions. It wasn't until January of 2026, this year, that another member was finally appointed and quorum was reached again. This isn't me making a political statement, I am stating the objective facts. All of this to say, the NLRB is in recent weeks issuing final decisions on charges initially filed in 2021. Now, when the process is finally over and done with, the results of that ruling will be public record, and God willing, I am still doing YouTube at that point in time, I will be happy to pour over that information. But there's a very strong chance we will not see it by the end of this decade. So what do we know? Well, the NLRB website has information about the case available, including the specific allegations at hand. But I want to take a moment to highlight that word, allegations. These are allegations. These are charges. These are not things that we can definitively say have or have not happened. I find it imperative to remind you we are looking at an ongoing legal process. With that said, let's start breaking this down. In February this year, Local H39 of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, or IATSE, filed charges against Spindlehorse. Local H39 is also known as the Animation Guild and successfully unionized the studio on September 16, 2025. The 5 allegations here accuse Spindlehorse of repudiation/modification of contract, refusal to furnish information, unlawful discharge, unlawful changes in terms and conditions of employment, and coercive statements, threats, promises of benefits, etc. Each allegation is paired with a specific reference to the National Labor Relations Act. Let's break these up a bit and talk about what parts of the law they are referencing. Section 8, subsection A of the National Labor Relations Act defines what constitutes an unfair labor practice by employers. Paragraph 1 states that it is illegal to interfere with, restrain, or coerce employees in the exercise of the rights guaranteed in Section 7, that is, the right to self-organization and to join a union. According to the charge against Spindlehorse, this included not just overt threats, but also promises of benefits and perhaps favoritism for people to not join. Paragraph 3 is a long one, but don't worry, the important stuff for our current purposes is near the top. The rest just makes sure that the law does not federally ban the practice of union shop, that is, employees who join a unionized workplace being required to join the union. Anyways, this paragraph states that it is illegal by discrimination in regards to hire or tenure of employment or any term or condition of employment to encourage or discourage membership in any labor organization. This means something similar to paragraph 1, more explicitly saying that you cannot fire people or change employment terms to persuade them towards or dissuade them from any kind of protected concerted activity. These two charges are alleging that Spindlehorse did exactly that. Paragraph 5 states that it is illegal for an employer to refuse to bargain collectively with the representatives of his employees, subject to the provisions of Section 9, subsection A. Section 9, subsection A clarifying that if a workplace is unionized, that union is the sole collective bargaining agent for the employees in that workplace. In that environment, an employer must negotiate with the agent's representative in order to make any change to agreed upon working conditions, such as hours, overtime policies, and of course, pay rates. The results of this negotiation are enshrined in a collective bargaining agreement, a binding contract that the employer and union both must abide by, and the negotiation to reach this agreement must be done in good faith. The last two charges allege that Spindlehorse did not provide information required by the union for negotiation and that they did not uphold the collective bargaining agreement. The latter charge references Section 8, subsection D, which again states that both the union and the employer must meet at reasonable times and act in good faith to reach an agreement and then uphold that agreement. With all this in mind, let's review the actual charge against the employer. On the NLRB website, they have linked to the document which includes an attachment describing the basis of the charge, a statement of the facts constituting the alleged unfair labor practices. It's very short, so let's go through it. Within the past 6 months, the above-named employer has unilaterally changed its terms and conditions of employment without providing notice or the opportunity to bargain to its employees' collective bargaining representative by 1. Prohibiting employees from working at the employer's office. 2. Freezing all promotions to full-time positions and transfers to other departments. And 3. Implementing a new policy to terminate employees at the end of projects and restrict their access to information regarding rehire. Now this still doesn't give us discrete details. It's written in a way that emphasizes the aspects of Spindlehorse's purported actions that would be considered, well, actionable. It's like the difference between saying hits in the head with a baseball bat and assault with a deadly weapon. I tried reaching out to local 839 for more details, but ultimately they declined to comment on an ongoing case. Once this case is finalized, that formal written decision will likely contain more discrete details, they usually do. With that said though, what we have now does still provide some insight into what's been allegedly happening. Let's start with the 3 subcomponents here. Prohibiting employees from working at the employer's office. Now this sounds like Spindlehorse is blocking people from working at the studio, forcing them to work from home and keeping them out of the building. Even in an online world, that's very socially isolating, especially if it limits how you can communicate with people outside of the company's own digital infrastructure. Freezing all promotions to full-time positions and transfers to other departments. So this is a big one. I've worked in a unionized workplace before, and we had a large cohort of full-time staff represented by the union, along with supplemental part-time staff who were not actually part of the union. However, part-time positions were fast tracks to full-time positions. Now, I don't have Spindlehorse's collective bargaining agreement in front of me. I don't know the written rules they have to follow regarding part-time temporary workers and their promotion to full-time, but whatever actions they took must have been irregular enough to be mentioned here. This clause also mentions freezing transfers to other departments. This indicates something potentially even more serious. If you join an animation studio like this, a common entry-level position is in-betweening, drawing every frame out between the keyframes. But let's say you're starting out here, and after getting practice, you decide you want to take an opening in the layout department, or character design, or the story department, transferring to whatever aspect of the animation process you want to specialize in. That's how you grow a career in the industry, in any industry really. According to the charge, Spindlehorse was blocking that career growth for people by not allowing them to transfer departments. Implementing a new policy to terminate employees at the end of projects and restrict the access to information regarding rehire. Again, this is something I can't really describe in detail because this could take a number of different forms. But Here's what it sounds like to me. Rather than the studio hiring on a team and then saying, okay, here are the projects we're working on. When we finish one, we'll add more on the queue. The studio reorganized the workflow. The phrase implementing a new policy really catches my eye there, and said, you are now hired on only to do this project, perhaps just this episode. Then you'll be technically terminated at the end, but don't worry, we'll immediately rehire you for the next episode. However, they would sometimes withhold information about rehiring from certain people in a way that violated the collective bargaining agreement. Now again, I don't know how accurate this hypothetical model in my mind is. I look over what I've described and it veers closer to independent contractors than direct employees. However, I imagine the general concept works similar to what I described, the key basis being using legal technicalities to try and tiptoe around the collective bargaining agreement's protections. Now let's go back to the beginning of this paragraph, which said, within the past 6 months, the above-named employer has unilaterally changed its terms and conditions of employment without providing notice or the opportunity to bargain to its employees' collective bargaining representative by doing the 3 things we just mentioned. Key word here, unilaterally. Obviously, things change. Sometimes a business suffers an unexpected setback. The union environment I worked at, I was there when COVID hit. The terms of the collective bargaining agreement were unsustainable, so the employer contacted the union and the pair of them worked out a new arrangement. This excerpt alleges that Spindlehorse changed its working conditions without conferring with its employees' duly chosen representative. That is not allowed. To really drill in how granular the law is here, yes, I am saying that regardless of how the conditions were changed, regardless if those changes were negative or even positive, the mere act of Spindlehorse unilaterally changing working conditions agreed to in the collective bargaining agreement would in itself constitute an unfair labor practice. Let's go to the next paragraph, which is actually largely identical to the previous one. However, it differs in this beginning part here. Within the past 6 months, the above-named employer has also discriminated and retaliated against employees for engaging in protected concerted activity. This recontextualizes everything we just talked about. The first paragraph alleges that Spindlehorse broke its duty to the union by preventing people from working in the office, freezing people's career progression, and trying to force people out of the company. This second paragraph alleges that Spindlehorse did these things to employees engaged in protected concerted activity. That is, people who were active in the union or otherwise collaborating with others to negotiate for better pay and working conditions. That is a separate unfair labor practice, which again is very serious. Let's go to the third paragraph now. Within the past 6 months, the above-named employer has further failed, refused, and delayed in providing information requested by the charging party. Basically charging that when the union got wind of all this, they reached out and asked, hey, what's going on? Can you give us some more context for these actions? Because maybe there was nuance to the situation. Maybe there was a legitimate reason behind all of these actions. But the union alleges here that the studio refused to provide information about these actions or purposefully delay that information in order to slow down the process with the hope of getting it dropped. And then the last bit. By these and other similar acts, the employer has violated Section 8, Subsection A, paragraphs 5, 3, and 1 of the National Labor Relations Act. Essentially a legal restatement of what we talked about before. And that is all the information I have about the case right now. So what is the takeaway from all this? First of all, I want to emphasize again that everything we've reviewed have been charges and allegations. These are not things we can say for sure have happened. These are not things we can say for sure have not happened. That said though, the fact that these charges exist at all is very serious. We are not talking about a Google Doc circulating on Twitter.com. IATSE is a very established labor union with legal counsel in their corner, and these organizations will only file a charge like this if they think they have a strong chance of winning. I also want to address something I've heard from folks in private. As I discussed this situation with friends, I heard a lot of disappointment that this happened even after the studio unionized. And I want to make something abundantly clear, this is actually what we want to see a union doing. Again, I've worked in a unionized workplace before, and it was great. I'd very highly recommend it. But a workplace unionizing doesn't automatically flip a switch that means nothing bad ever happens there anymore. A union instead acts as a bargaining agent. In the United States, a nation where your very access to medical care is dependent on having a job, a nation with at-will employment, which means you can be fired for any reason, including no reason at all, a negotiation between an employer and employee is inherently unequal. Having a union means that there is greater bargaining power and protection from abuse. That protection manifests in legal action. Labor and employment law in this country is kind of a mess. Yes, it is against the law to discriminate in employment on the bases of things like race and gender and religion, and it is also against the law to fire someone for engaging in labor organizing. Yet again, the United States has at-will employment, which means if you feel you've been fired unjustly, the burden falls on you to prove that you were fired for an illegal reason. You have to build a case. You have to take years of expensive legal action after your source of income has just been taken away. That is, unless you have a union with a pool of resources and legal counsel on hand for precisely this scenario. The fact that this charge exists is not proof that the Animation Guild isn't doing its job, it's the union doing its job. And finally, the part I'm sure people are foaming at the mouth over, what is Vivian Medrano's role in all this? Yes, it is true she is not personally named in any of the charges here. We've gone this whole video without naming her until now. However, she is the chief executive officer of Spindlehorse. She is the owner of Spindlehorse. This isn't an art student doodling on string for Patreon backers anymore. She owns and runs a studio that works with A24 and Amazon Prime now. Playtime is over. To repeat myself once again, it is totally possible that these charges could all be dismissed without any action being required from the studio. But make no mistake, this is serious legal trouble, and she is involved in it. I'll keep tabs on developments in this case, and if there's anything I think is substantial, I'll be happy to talk about it. But like I said, it'll be some years before we get a conclusion to this whole saga. So, yeah, on a last note, go talk to your coworkers about your wages and salaries. It's a protected action. Look it up. Okay, bye-bye.